Now, by 1979, Carter was weak, but he was also up for re-election in 1980. And he was challenged by a couple of people in his own party. I believe Edward Kennedy and Jesse Jackson both ran against him. But the Republican Party was the one that was going to put up the biggest challenge. And his, as Carter being unpopular, it was a very good chance that any Republican would have defeated Carter or any legitimate Republican candidate. But the one they put forth was maybe the perfect candidate for the time. His name was Ronald Reagan, and he was a former governor of California, a former, and he came in, and I'll talk a little bit more of his background in a minute, but he came in and he called, during the campaign, and called for decreasing taxes, increasing military spending, which had been rolled back after Vietnam, and shrink the role of the federal government, downsize the federal government and give more power back to the states. His economic policies were the opposite of the New Deal kind of economic policies. Whereas the New Deal, their economic theory, Roosevelt's New Deal, and everybody after that, was you put the money in the hands of the people who spend it, and that will drive production. If people want to spend money, that creates demand. Then companies will create products to meet that demand. Reagan, on the other hand, believed in something called trickle-down economics, or supply side economics. And he said what you do is you put money in the hands of the already wealthy people, the industrialists, the business owners, through tax cuts mainly. And with that money, they will expand their business, which would create jobs. And then the money will trickle down to the people. It was controversial. Even future President George Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, who will eventually be his vice president, when he was running against him in the primary in 1980, the Republican primary, he actually called this type of economics voodoo economics. But anyway, Reagan won the election by a landslide. His background: he was a former Democrat. He was a New Deal Democrat who had changed over to the Republicans. He was a former actor, I believe president of the Screen Actors Guild. And he was a very charismatic person. He knew how to play the cameras. He was a former actor, so he knew how to work the cameras. He knew how to portray what he wanted to portray. He was supported by religious fundamentalists, small government supporters, and white Southerners. That whole Southern strategy that Nixon had implemented was finally coming to fruition. And this would be the new conservative coalition that really exists to this day. Religious fundamentalists, small government supporters, and white Southerners. Early on in his presidency, he had tax cuts, but that increased, when you cut taxes and increased military spending, well, that's going to increase the deficit because you're bringing less money in with the tax cuts and sending more money out with the increased spending. So that's going to create deficits, meaning debt. So Reagan, today he's this hero of lower taxes. He actually raised taxes during his presidency in order to mitigate this deficit spending. He was also a union-busting president. He didn't like labor unions. He thought they were harmful. And of course, he was always a supporter of business, this big business, not necessarily supporters of workers. So when the air traffic controllers went on strike, the U.S. air traffic controllers, he basically fired all of them and hired new ones. But over time, his raising of taxes and his raising of taxes and his increase in the military spending began to lead to an economic revival, kind of an improvement in the economy. In his first term in his foreign affairs, during his first term as president, the U.S. was supporting covert operations in Central America to overturn what were becoming some leftist governments, some more leftist, communist-leaning, socialist-leaning governments had taken control in some of these Central American countries, including El Salvador. And so the CIA, with the approval of President Reagan and his staff, began covert operations to try to dislodge those governments. Although they were duly elected governments, we were trying to put in a government more to our liking, or more to the president's liking. Okay, here is the election of 1980 results. As you can see, it was just a landslide, both in the electoral vote, 489 to 49, and the popular vote, almost 44 million to about 35.5 million. There was an independent candidate who drew almost 6 million votes, but that wouldn't have made a difference probably if he hadn't run. But anyway, as you can see, the only states that Carter won were Minnesota, Georgia, looks like West Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey. Oh, and Hawaii and Washington, D.C. And so Reagan's first term was relatively successful. He had the ups and downs like most presidents do. But by his beginning of his second term, he had to win the election of 1984. And he runs against Walter Mondale, who was, I believe, the vice president of Jimmy Carter, and defeats him pretty handily in the election of 1984. And so his second term begins. New tax reductions, and to offset the tax reductions, because if you have less taxes coming in, you have less money to spend. Instead of decreasing military spending, he decreased social programs for the poor and for the elderly and others. And that's one of the things, the negatives that a lot of people say to this day are that tie in with Reagan. But in foreign affairs, the Iran-Contra affair was probably his low point as president. Uh, Congress had cut off funding for what were called the Contras, which were a revolutionary group that was trying to overthrow this group called the Sandinistas in El Salvador. And the Sandinistas were a leftist-leaning leader, and the Contras were trying to overthrow them, and they were being funded secretly after Congress had cut off the funding for it. That they were kind of money laundering money that they had gotten from an arms for hostages deal uh, in the Middle East. And so they were taking this illegal money and funneling it illegally outside of Congress's law to the Contras. And they got caught. And while Reagan never took the fall, and nobody was ever able to pin any knowledge on Reagan, that's why they call him the Teflon president, because nothing sticks to him. Some of his advisors, specifically a colonel named Oliver North, basically took the fall. And and in this Iran-Contra affair. Soviet Union at this time was changing dramatically. They had basically come to a realization by the mid 1980s that they could not continue to keep up with the United States economically in the Cold War as far as the arms race. And a new type of leader, a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev, came in, and he pushed for arms reductions, a more open Soviet government to the rest of the world, some democratic reforms. So Mikhail Gorbachev was kind of upset in the apple cart for the old school communists. Also during the Reagan's second term, you see the beginning of the computer revolution. The personal computer becomes very common now. There was points in the 60s and the 70s where computers existed, but it was just like this weird hobby of some people. But by the 80s, it becomes kind of ubiquitous, meaning it's everywhere, and it creates this economic opportunity for people who begin just crazy investing in these upstart computer companies, even though they may not be making any money, or their product may be faulty. It was just the cool thing to do to invest in a computer company. So that creates an economic boom, specifically in the stock market, and it creates what's called a stock market bubble, meaning the stock market is overvalued based on really what it should be worth. And of course, eventually that bubble is always going to burst, and it burst in 1987 with the stock market crash. Uh, a lot of the blame went to huge budget deficits, because the budget deficits continued with the increased military spending, and that had a lot to do with the market crash, but it had to do with the computer bubble, that a lot of people were over investing in computer stocks. Also during this time, because of Reagan's policies of tax cuts for the wealthy, and no real economic help for the poor and the middle class, you start seeing the beginning of a growing disparity between the economic disparity between the wealthy and the average American citizen. You start seeing that wealth gap increase. Also during this time, Reagan's second term, AIDS, autoimmune deficiency syndrome, HIV, comes to the forefront with some high-profile people uh, admitting, coming out, stating that they had AIDS. It all started early in the 80s with the actor Rock Hudson and the rock star Freddie Mercury. But then people like Magic Johnson, the basketball player, and initially it was a disease that was, and it was a deadly disease at the time when it first came out. There was no cure. It was tied to the gay community. Gay men were the people that mainly got it. But then when Magic Johnson got it, who was heterosexual and married and had children, uh, it could also be passed through, and a lot of times this is how it was passed to heterosexual men and heterosexual people, is through the sharing of hypodermic needles in drug use. And so that would, or it could be, transferred over through bisexual individuals. But the point is, though, that it became really an epidemic, and and it really kind of scared everybody, and it really changed the way people talked about sex and talked about safety and protection. Also during this time, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, which was a well, it was a Soviet country, but the Afghan, it was part of the Soviet Union, but the Afghan people have been rising up against the existing government, and so the Soviets sent in their military to put it down, and the U.S. Did not support this at all, of course. And there's always that phrase that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, they didn't like the Soviet Union; that was their enemy. So these freedom fighters that were trying to dislodge the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, they were our friends because they were the enemy of the Soviet Union. So we began secretly funding them and helping them and training them, and and eventually we'll talk about this in the next unit. Eventually, these freedom fighters are they will call themselves the Mujahideen. They will end up defeating the Soviet Union and establish their own government. And of course, we supported them in this, and gave them the weapons and gave them the money and gave them the training. But this Mujahideen, once they became got to power, they took over the government and changed their name, at least in our parlance, to the Taliban, which will of course be the group that supports and protects and helps train Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Now, Reagan's legacy, as far as his presidency, he begins the modern conservative revolution that still exists to this day. Reagan came in and kind of, it was a backlash, as I said, as I've always talked about in this class. Every um, social movement or every period in history has its reaction. And the liberal 60s and 70s, the reaction was the conservative backlash, the conservative revolution. So a new conservative revolution, a sense of American pride after the humiliation of the Vietnam War and Watergate and all that. He oversees the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. It is during Reagan's presidency that the Soviet Union kind of begins to falter. Uh, and he dismantled and decreased many social service programs that had been implemented in the 60s and the 70s to help the poor and the disenfranchised and those with less. This is just a photo of President Reagan on the left and Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet premier, on the right, sitting around looking like they're having a nice discussion. Of course, Reagan served 2 terms. Of course, there was an attempted assassination during his second term. I failed to mention that in the previous tile. But the election of 1988, George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, runs against Massachusetts senator, either senator or governor, I'm not exactly sure. I have to go back and check. A guy named Michael Dukakis. It was a not a very close race. You know, people supported Bush because of his ties with Reagan, and he called for. He basically had two famous phrases that he used during the campaign against Dukakis. First, he wanted a kinder, gentler nation, and because we were seen as kind of a bully under Reagan. And then when he was pressed on raising taxes by the anti-tax people, he promised them, he said, read my lips, no new taxes, stating that he would never raise taxes. Well, early on in his presidency, after he won, he reneged on the no new taxes pledge, and he angered many of the more conservative people in his political party, and they would not support him in the upcoming his win for his reelection. The Soviet Union began two policies, one called perestroika, which is a restructuring of the Soviet establishment. You know, the old Kremlin and the old Kremlin establishment, and the other is glasnost, which is openness. Which, as I mentioned before, was this idea that the Soviets should be more open to the rest of the world, less paranoid, and um, Gorbachev was the leader of this. Of course, it angered a lot of the old school Soviets, and but anyway, also in 1989, you had something called the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. Tiananmen Square is kind of like the mall in Washington or the Kremlin in the Soviet Union. It's where like the center of power is, and many students had shown up on Tiananmen Square to begin protesting for more democratic reforms, more open government, much like perestroika and glasnost, more freer, more open media, and it became this big deal where it went from a few students to thousands and thousands of people just cramming into Tiananmen Square to uh, to protest against the government. Even national international media came in. All of the major national networks in the United States were there, and this went on for a couple of weeks. And then one day, the Chinese military went in and basically kicked all the media out, all the networks out, and so there's nobody there taking film. But eyewitnesses have said that basically they just went in and began massacring those students in Tiananmen Square, killing if hundreds, if not thousands of them. And to this day, if you Google Tiananmen Square in China, all you get is a pretty picture through the Chinese internet. All you get is a nice stories and pictures of Tiananmen Square itself, the place, and there's nothing about the historical massacre that you can get uh, in China. Uh, Finally, with the Soviet Union with glasnost and perestroika taking hold, also with the serious economic problems that were happening in the Soviet Union, caused by the Cold War and caused by the arms races. Uh, what happened was the Soviet Union basically was spending too much money on the military and not enough on the infrastructure of the country and the actual economy in the country. And so the economy ended up collapsing, and of course that's going to lead to the collapse of the government. And so as the empire collapses and all these satellite countries begin to overthrow their or throw off their Soviet yoke, you know, they would declare their independence, and the Soviets wouldn't even try to stop them. Places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, they would just say, okay, we're no longer part of the Soviet Union. And 20 years prior to this, the Soviets would have went in and crushed them, but they didn't have the willpower, the money, or the military to do it anymore. So all of these countries started just leaving the Soviet Union. And when this, Gorbachev was overthrown and taken over by an alcoholic named Boris Yeltsin, who took over and ran the country for a while. Also, during Bush's presidency, you have the removal of Manuel Noriega as the leader of Panama. They we charged Noriega with laundering drug money. This was the beginning, really, the ramping up of what had become the drug war of under Ronald Reagan, where much of the drugs came out of Colombia. And of course, Panama is adjacent to Colombia. Panama is the pathway from South America into Central America. And supposedly Noriega was funneling drugs and laundering money down there, and the U.S. sent the military in to dislodge him from power in what would be a really short little, I guess it was a little war, but very successful, very quick. Uh, and then the first Gulf War. The first Gulf War was a reaction to the incursion of Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, into a tiny adjacent country, a very oil-rich country called Kuwait. Historically, Iraq had claimed Kuwait as its own, but in some of these post-war dividing up of territories in the Middle East, Kuwait was made its own country, and Iraq and Saddam Hussein decided it wanted it back. So they go in, Iraq goes in and occupies Kuwait. Well, the U.S. won't stand for this, so the U.S. goes in and intervenes to get them out of Kuwait. And one of the places they go and they station themselves and they prepare for battle is Saudi Arabia, which is adjacent. And this is a big deal because it is seen as anti-Islamic if you have the infidels, or the non-Islamic people bringing their military into their very sacred country. Saudi Arabia is likely the most sacred Islamic country on earth, according to Muslims. And you're letting in the Saudi leadership was letting the U.S. military station themselves there, and it greatly angered many of the Islamic fundamentalists. But anyway, we from our bases in Saudi Arabia, we go in and we dislodge Saddam from Kuwait and push him back into Iraq. And then there's a debate. There's a debate about whether they should continue on instead of just pushing Saddam out of Kuwait and back into Iraq. Should they go ahead and go all the way into Baghdad and take out Saddam Hussein? Because he's always been kind of a thorn in our side. But some of the people that were involved in the decision-making process at the time, including the Secretary of Defense named Dick Cheney, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff named Colin Powell, they decided not to, and for very logical reasons. They said, look, we're going in here. We don't know what will happen if we take him out because we have all these different rival factions in Iraq that Saddam kind of keeps under wraps, and it'll leave a vacuum leadership. I mean, we have no plan to get out of Iraq if we go in. If we do take him out, how do we get out? So these are very logical reasons not to go in and finish him off, because we have no escape or exit strategy. We have no leader to put in place, and we have these factions within the country that will just go at each other's throats in a civil war if we take Saddam out. Of course, they don't think about these very same things in 2003 when they go into Iraq. But anyway, so the result was a very quick war. At the end of the Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush had the highest approval ratings of any president in history, 92%. And just ahead of him is the election in 1992. And with those approval ratings, you would think that he would have the election in the bag, but he didn't. The economy was going back in the tank. The economy was in a recession, unemployment was increasing, and Bush got challenged in his own Republican primary from the right, those angry people who were mad because he raised taxes. And then the Democrats put forth a new type of candidate. They put forth a guy named William Jefferson Bill Clinton from Arkansas. And he was not your traditional liberal Democratic candidate that you had seen with Walter Mondale, Eugene McGovern, Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson, some of those guys. Those are all just traditional New Deal Democrats. Jefferson, William Bill Clinton was different. He wasn't as liberal, and he believed there was a third way. He came in and said, look, it doesn't just have to be the old school liberal way, the old school conservative way. What if we combine the two? What if we blend the two? What if we find a third way? And this was his idea, and it caught on with a lot of people. And he, of course, he had some background problems. He was a philanderer. He cheated on his wife. And that came up during the primary, but he got very good at defending himself and not justifying the things he did, but defending himself against these charges. Uh, he chose Al Gore, another young Democrat from the South, from Tennessee, as his vice president. And that was one of the first times where a successful political campaign had not balanced the ticket with somebody, a president from one part of the country and a vice president from another, or a president with one ideology and maybe the vice president with a lesser or more extreme ideology. They were basically two in the same. Of course, Clinton was referred to by many as Slick Willie because he could talk his way out of anything. He was amazing, really, in that capacity. But one of the things that probably led to more than anything to Clinton's victory in this election was the entering of the race of a guy named Ross Perot from Texas, a billionaire from Texas, who his main reason for joining the election was to prevent the passage of something called the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which was basically an agreement, a treaty between Mexico, the United States, and Canada to basically do away with all border regulations and tariffs and things that limited trade between the three nations. And famously, Ross Perot, he'd get on TV with his commercials with charts, and he would have this really squeaky voice and funny voice, but he would say things that really caught on. And one of these things he said was famously, he said, if NAFTA is passed by Congress, that giant sucking sound you hear will be jobs leaving America and going to Mexico. And he was right, but he didn't win the election, but he was very popular. He got about 18% of the vote, which is enough to, and many of those votes came from those who would have maybe supported Bush. But Clinton ended up winning the presidency with only 43% of the vote. And so with Clinton's victory, we're going to enter a new era